Alright, my persuasive argument is post-traumatic stress, other known as PTSD. Post-traumatic stress happens when someone is exposed to a highly traumatic event, most commonly found in war veterans. Some of the common symptoms are severe anxiety and depression, which is usually coped with by heavy drinking or drug use. In extreme cases, people who suffer this would even commit suicide. PTSD is a prevalent disorder which hinders many war veterans and needs to be dealt with more effectively. The morbid realm of reenactment is perhaps the cruelest feature of this disorder, variously labeled as shell shock, soldier's heart, combat fatigue, and post-traumatic stress disorder. An example of reenactments, Barker's remarkable World War I novel, a character known as Burns reenacts the moment when the concussive force of an explosion plunges him headfirst into a German corpse, bursting the German gas-distended belly. Now whenever he tries to eat, that taste and smell reoccur. Nightly he relives the experience, and from every nightmare he awakes vomiting. Each term marks the psychiatric casualties of a succession of modern wars. David Rudd, a military researcher, a dean of College of Social and Behavioral Sciences at the University of Utah, said he sees two main categories of troops who are committing suicide at an accelerating pace. Iraq and Afghanistan war veterans are suffering from depression, post-traumatic stress disorder, or substance abuse, and those who have not gone to war but face trouble personal relationships, money problems, or legal wounds. Another example of PTSD is Jacob Venva, who was a rising leader in the Navy before a non-combat soldier injury forced him to leave the service. When he came home, Venna dealt with anger and anxiety by drinking. From a historical perspective, PTSD is a recurring disorder in every military establishment, according to the Department of Defense. Looking back, PTSD has been in every military conflict in the United States history, but it may not have been noticed because of the lack of knowledge since the beginning of the war. The United States PTSD was called many different things, such as soldier's heart, shell shock, combat fatigue, and then finally PTSD. This disorder was often untreated or overlooked because of their lack of knowledge on the subject. This can be seen in the rise of suicides over the years. According to the statistics from the Department of Defense, it is now becoming evident that the combat trauma was fairly widespread in the American Civil War and far from unknown in the Russo-Japanese War. Only with World War I did it reach nearly epidemic proportions, and under the label shell shock assumed the status of the disorder, recognized, if gradually, by the military and medical establishment of the belligerent. They were far from prepared for it, as Rivers, who came to play a leading role in the diagnosis of and treatment of combat trauma, was pointed out. The medical administration of our own and other armies was wildly unprepared for the vast extent and varied forms in which modern warfare is able to upset the higher functions of the nervous system and the mental activity of those called upon to take it in part. There have been multiple cases of PTSD that were present but were overlooked in many officials. The historical situation with PTSD is largely like the current one now, but the people are starting to notice more and are asking tough questions. An Army reporter on his suicide concluded that the lack of communication between Fort Campbell officials and Fairbanks commander in the Iraq was cause of considerable reflection and concern. There are cases like Jacob Fairbanks, St. Paul native, who was sent to continue a second tour in Afghanistan after telling a doctor and social worker at Campbell that he was suicidal. He had suicidal thoughts. Fairbanks also sought counseling for the Marshall material problems and depression. But his commander in Iraq were not alerted or told that he had been given a prescription for an antidepressant. Fairbanks killed himself to a gunshot to the head. The current situation in PTSD is a little bit better now than in the past. Its betterment of the situation of PTSD can largely be accredited to the increase of avenues in which soldiers can seek treatment. These avenues are VFW clubs, grief counseling, military counselors, and psychiatrics. These things aren't always enough, and many soldiers slip through the cracks without being noticed or helped. The ones that have been diagnosed with PTSD post 9/11 make up 30% of Iraq and war veterans treated in the VA hospitals. The lack of treatment can be pointed at the Pentagon system. The Pentagon is to blame because of the lack of action, according to Defense Secretary Leon Patton. According to a 2011 article written by Mark Brunswick, PTSD is currently affecting returning soldiers from all walks of life. Some were mechanics, some were students, some worked construction, all were soldiers in the Minnesota National Guard. 30% of Iraq's and Afghanistan's war veterans treated at VA hospitals and clinics nationally have been diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder. On Sunday, the Star Tribune reported on a case of one Iraq war veteran who went to Minneapolis VA Hospital last year expecting to be admitted after hearing voices and feeling clairvoyant. Instead, he was told that he was not a threat to himself or others and was told to return to a few days later. In the midst of what would happen, be later diagnosed as psychiatric break, he stole a car, ended up being struck by a van as he ran across rush hour traffic. The current situation is alarming. The current problems and challenges are seen as the increase in suicides, the increase needed for better communication between soldiers, the military ranks. According to an article by the Associated Press in 2013, suicides in the U.S. military surged to a record of 349 last year, for exceeding American combat deaths in Afghanistan, and some private experts are predicting the dark trend will worsen this year. Veterans seen by the hospital's mental health unit have increased by 23% in the past 5 years. Staffing of the unit is up to 22% over the same time frame. At the state's other VA hospitals in St. Cloud, the number of veterans seen for mental health issues has risen by almost 30% since 2006. An example of poor communication is as follows. There are cases like Jacob Fairbanks, St. Paul native, who was sent to continue a second tour in Iraq after telling a doctor and social workers for Campbell that he has suicidal thoughts. Fairbanks also sought counseling for mental problems and depression, but his commanders in Iraq were not alerted or told that he had been given a prescription for antidepressants. Fairbanks was killed with a gunshot to the head. An Army report on his suicide concluded that the lack of communication between Fort Campbell officials, the Fairbanks commanders in Iraq, was cause of considerable reflection and concern. Some of the things that needed to be done to work on the future challenges that face veterans with PTSD is have increased places to go to treat this problem, have the lines of communication open among the ranks, and also have places that especially deal with the challenges and veterans face that have PTSD, such as a special court. The Department of Veterans Affairs on Thursday announced plans to increase the mental health staffing by 1,900 positions, responding to the rising needs of returning Iraq and Afghanistan veterans and complaints of long waits and misdiagnosed diagnoses. Shinsky announced the department would add about 1,600 mental nurses, for psychiatrists and psychologists, and social workers, as well as nearly 300 support staff members to its existing mental health workforce of 2,590 as part of an ongoing review of mental health operations. The VA will allocate funds from the current budget to 21 VA service networks across the country this month to begin immediate recruiting. Hennepin County launched one of the first largest veterans courts in the country in 2010. Since then, the number of these innovative programs has continued to expand as many veterans struggled to readjust to civilian life. Several counties such as Ramsey don't have formal veterans courts, but they have set up a protocol for a vet that partly mirrors how the formal ones operate. District Judge John Stelzlet, a Vietnam veteran, has developed a protocol in his sprawling district covering 13 counties in western Minnesota. He revived a grant to hire a veterans advocate to work in Pope and Stevens counties. They have hired hundreds of mental health and substance abuse counselors. It is working on a 5-year, $50 million studies with the National Institute of Mental Health to identify the best practices for intervention in the lives of troubled soldiers. It's beefing up 24/7 teleconferencing and online programs for soldiers in isolated areas. It also has unveiled a suicide prevention program known as the ACE Ask, Care and Escort that uses DVDs, handouts, and tip cards for soldiers and their families and friends on how to recognize and respond to suicidal impulses. Personal perspective on post-traumatic stress syndrome. PTSD is when someone is exposed to a very traumatic event, most commonly found in war veterans. Throughout every war in history, there's been signs of PTSD, but no one knew what it was or could really understand it. Now that we have education and better knowledge on this subject, we are doing more to help the cause, like making these veteran courts have more avenues for treatment, etc. One of the problems that we are facing is that we do not have enough counselors to help the veterans that are coming to tell us that they have PTSD. Another problem is that the government is trying to hide the fact that PTSD is a rising problem and can't be ignored, and how they are trying to help the cause. But if they would have helped earlier, and not tried to just hide it, there would have been more lives saved. The government is now hiring more social workers and doing as much as possible to stop military suicide rate from rising. I think that if the government would have addressed the cause at the start, of the civilian population would understand more about PTSD, and it would have slowed the suicide rate and less military members would have died. The civilian population would have been able to help the cause as well as understand it and know what their soldiers are doing for their country, and give those soldiers as much respect and help as possible. This is my personal perspective on post-traumatic stress syndrome and how we the people can help our veterans and to live a better life, knowing that what they did was worth it so we can live free. And this is my perspective arguing it, so yeah.